You need to constantly be viewing what's coming and the timing of those pieces.
Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
So I thought I'd start with just a brief discussion of like what tools are designed specifically to help organizations keep up with this. So if you're not aware of it, in Microsoft 365, all in the app that you might have on your phone or in the portal, in both of those experiences, there's this message center. And the message center is actually pretty useful. It has, specific insights that it provides around, what's coming and what to plan for. So some things require pretty significant change, right? This is deprecated if you still have this kind of functionality and you've built some stuff on there. It may break after this date window. So like, how InfoPath is eventually going to break, things like that. Or like SharePoint Designer workflows, right? That were based on SharePoint Workflow 2010, a short time ago, things like that, right? So there are definitely scenarios like that where if you were to pay attention here, you'd see those notices, and there's different sort of ratings that they have. But it's also really helpful because it can be connected. So one of the big problems that we run into, a mistake that we often make, is that IT or the people who admin your Microsoft 365 instance, they might have access to this data and this message center, but a lot of business managers or other people who might support IT or even an extended IT team may not have access to this. So it's really important to make sure you're distributing this information in various ways. So you can connect it to a planner out of the box. It actually has this sort of loader model where it loads the data into a planner, or you can use email notifications, which I'm a big fan of as well, right? So people can essentially get the emails for these, and you can also filter those, right? So make sure you're getting the ones that are require change or really strategic versus maybe every possible update, because there's quite a few. So I wanted to start with that. Any comments from you, Christian, on like the message center, what you've seen from customers around use of it and those types of patterns?
Well, one thing I would point out is that this has evolved, as you mentioned, greatly over the last few years, and it's great that Microsoft has taken that feedback and they understand, one, that more than just the admins who have access at the top level need to have access to these things. So they provided that with the Teams integration. Two, but the filtering and the more data that is your ability to go in and filter and view those things which are impacting your tenant directly, the things that you want to go and focus on. You have the ability to go and again filter your view of the message center updates. So this is something that I've seen other organizations do. We do it inside of AvePoint as well, where it's pushed out to teams in one place, and then there's a couple of us that go in and triage that. And so once it's in Planner, then we can mention, we can assign tasks to people, we can move things across that. So we actually have buckets. They call the columns buckets in Planner. We have buckets for things that we know will have an impact on one of our existing systems or within our tenant. And then there are things like we just don't know. We need to have the product team go and do a deeper dive around. And then the things that we just know are not impacts at all, but we maintain all those things so that as they come through, we're able to then do that triaging, assign to people, and get a larger group of people involved. And so it's just a great best practice for that. They have one person or a team of people going in and doing that, but just to make sure that nothing is slipping by and catching you unaware.
The other one that I think comes up a lot is understanding how Microsoft does the updates. So there's sort of rings is the way it's described. We have sort of public rings. There's a sort of first release ring. And that's an important distinction because you as an organization can pick individuals that are in first release, depending on the workload too, because like Windows has a first release, there's different types of first releases. And so they can get updates, for Office, or they can get updates for the Microsoft 365 experiences earlier than the broader organizations. Generally speaking, we find most organizations have IT as first release, pretty much everyone in IT, so that they can experience, those things directly themselves and then be more prepared for support or discussions around it. But the other pattern that we've even seen is having like champions, like business champions in the organization that are, if not technical, they're at least more interested in some of this newer stuff, and having them in first release programs. So it's important when you get these messages, even if it's not going to be, generally applied for a few months, messaging like those pools of people that are first release earlier and saying like, hey, this, you may notice this change, we're aware of it. Here's how, what we think of it. It's generally not going to be an impact. Like those are also really important. So having kind of a communication strategy that mirrors what Microsoft does here can be quite helpful, especially if you summarize, right? Maybe like on a weekly or monthly basis, a few of those key announcements, because it also feels like IT is being more proactive to those champion groups. So this is also a great way to like stimulate a little bit of that discussion where people are like, oh, this is new. Help me understand that more. You capture that business interest early, hopefully before it's as disruptive, right? So you have more time to cycle through that. Well, let me move on to the next one, which is the roadmap, and then we can have maybe a discussion about this, because this is one that I struggle with, of course. Azure is next to impossible. I've essentially given up on knowing everything that, all across multi-clouds for Amazon, Azure, et cetera. But when it comes to Microsoft 365, it's still possible to know, kind of everything in the roadmap. I think it's hard, but it's possible. What you run into now is that there's some stuff that's not represented in the roadmap as well, and that can be problematic. So what is there is the ability for you to search, to filter, to refine. It's really nice to see what's already launched. I really appreciate it for the history, because you can actually see when things launched. Like this feature launched a year ago or half a year ago. That becomes very valuable, at least for me, when I'm doing management across multiple tenants and customers. The other one that's really helpful is sometimes people will ask for a thing, and I often will look at the roadmap to see if that thing is public or if there's an example of that might be coming. Because when you click on the more options in these roadmaps, it actually often goes to like an article or an explanation of what that feature might look like or how it might function from Ignite or something like that. The problem with this is you can't really do certain types of searches. So if you're looking for like intranet updates, the word intranet it's not like a bunch of things are tagged with intranet, right? SharePoint news updates and things like that. So it is very technical, and it does require a human being or someone to parse, the roadmap updates and then provide that direction to the business, whether that's done with a friend or done internally, with a domain expert internally or externally. I definitely think like having a focused individual or set of individuals kind of split up the roadmap and pay attention to certain categories can be really, really helpful for making sure stuff doesn't slip through the cracks. Again, the message center is sort of your backup, right? Like, if you missed those earlier visibility points in the roadmap, you'll catch it. But that's how I would typically use the roadmap. And I also honestly use it sometimes to just be like, what has changed? In the last, sometimes it's been a while, since we've addressed some of these technologies. So it's really useful just to look at a little bit of that past history. What's recently changed in the last 6 months since we had an organizational sort of discussion right around this. But yeah, any feedback from your side, Christian, on how you use the roadmap or how you parse this data regularly?
Well, I mean, again, a lot of changes that have happened to this, and while it's not perfect, very happy that Microsoft has added additional refiners, made it easy to go. But I think you just described exactly the scenario that I use it. Is sometimes something does slip by, or I think there's not really an impact to that, and then a feature set or a product gets more mature, and I can go do a deep dive and look at the history. Where are we? What was released there? Like we were talking before we started recording around the information management, the compliance and records management capabilities. And I'm not following everything on a day-to-day basis that's changing there, but I can come back to the roadmap and go and look through that historical view. But to your point, I can't look at the broad terms. Maybe the word intranet shows up in a description of something. It's not going to pick things up. It's not going to align you based on features. So you do have to pay attention enough to know, here are the products, here are the features, here's the internal Microsoft language that's being used to describe this thing that I care about, and then go find, follow, and tag content based on that.
The other resource that we didn't put a slide together for, but that's kind of complementary to this, is the blogs. So, and I actually love how Microsoft's now doing these sort of summary blogs. At least the SharePoint team and a few other teams are doing it. Where I think the Teams team is doing it as well. Where you're going to get like what's changed this month, right? Because there's so many changes actually within a month cadence often. And so it's in the roadmap, a lot of these examples. But what they do is they have these blog articles that kind of summarize what those changes are, with visual examples and things like that. And they always reference roadmap items, which is very helpful to kind of show that, full cohesion there. So another example, if you're really, gung-ho about this, I would certainly encourage you to, to follow some of those blogs in whatever form you prefer, or even just check them regularly. Like the Viva blog is quite useful, the Teams blog, the SharePoint blog, and then, situationally, whatever specific areas of interest you have, there's different blogs for those. So those are the official blogs, and they do a great job summarizing. And then there's communities, which have way more density of information, because essentially what people do is they talk about these roadmap items, or they say, hey, I have this problem or this gap, and then there's some exposure there. But, I definitely would also encourage the official blogs as resources. It can be a lot, to try and pay attention to Message Center, this and those blogs. So what I would do is, again, kind of lean towards one of them as your primary. Maybe it's the roadmap, maybe it's those blogs, depending on just how niche or focused your Microsoft management is, right, for 365.
Honestly, Richard, it's still a little too spread out for my taste. And this is something that because this is one of those questions, those discussions, like, what do you follow? And when people say, how do you keep up? So much of it is around it. Like, I agree, you can get a lot of the broader announcements, the big picture things. If you go to the Microsoft 365 blog, that's where you'll see those summaries, like all Teams updates for March 2022. You'll get a blog post that goes through at the high level. So it used to be, it was like there were product managers, product marketers, two different roles, doing a similar, blogs on their personal blogs. That's not really happening anymore, thankfully. But you also need to go and follow the one other place to go and follow where some of the second tier official announcements are made are through the Microsoft tech community. So if you're following the blogs and the communities within that, that's where you'll see. In fact, when you see a Yammer announcement or a new stream capability or whatever, it's going to be through a blog post on the Microsoft tech community, and then maybe summarized also within the Microsoft 365 blog. And then you'll see maybe some geek out engineering speak of features on a personal blog somewhere. But thankfully, that has reduced, because it just made it impossible. Like, we hear about stuff like, where did you hear that? Oh, I followed such and such personal blog. Why are they making announcements about features on somebody's personal blog with it? So that they've cleaned that up. So it really is. It's Message Center updates, roadmap, Microsoft 365 blog, and the tech community blog posts. Those are the four core places that I keep up for the official communications. And then there's the next tier, the peer community, people that just seem to have their ear to the wall outside of Microsoft headquarters.
If you have a friend who's, exactly. If this is their job or they work across customers, it's a lot easier to get their feedback.
There are definitely trusted community voices that are out there, right?
The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly here is I find a lot of customers aren't proactive with their roadmaps. And I think this is a big gap. So, we talked about technology changes Microsoft's driving, and, let's take Viva as an example, right? So there's a lot of new Viva products, right? We have 4, I guess 5 quote unquote official ones, right? We have Viva Insights, Viva Learning, Viva Topics, Viva Connections, and then, what is Ali.io and whatever it eventually gets called. But there are probably many more Viva experiences that will come. And as these new workloads become available, they solve an industry problem, right? So when Microsoft doesn't build something to generally create categories of interest, they kind of take the most democratized problems that organizations have, and they say, okay, let's find a solution that is good in the market and either acquire that, or let's build that core capability into our platform. And so if you think about where Microsoft is, they're yes, they are at the cutting edge sometimes, but most of the time they're kind of they have both sides, right? The sort of legacy long tail capture, and then they have these newer ones. And so if you think of your own roadmap, if we don't have a roadmap, what ends up happening is these things kind of crash and land, right? So let me use an example. There's this really great analogy with radars. So you have like an airport, and if you think of all the planes that are up in the air, Viva Learning, or, what Viva Learning represents, social learning and peer-to-peer learning and concepts like that. So I have this learning need in my organization and I have a solution. Well, what's going to happen is if I don't plan for it to land on the runway, it's still going to land. It's just some business unit is going to go drive Viva Learning, right? Because they're like, hey, we need this. And they're going to drive its acceleration and it's going to land. And then IT is going to reactively respond to that, fighting literally fires sometimes because it crash landed instead of landing the way that we wanted it to, right? So using that same analogy, what we're trying to do is figure out, what is like now in the next, 0 to 6 months, what's further out, the 6 to 12 months, stuff we still need to figure out that's in flight, right? How is it going to eventually land? And then there might be some speculative stuff, right? That's even further out that we think about, like, oh, we'd love to be doing these things, right? So these are more like envisioning art of the possible things. Like these are the things we'd like to map towards or make our way towards, like the end state. And so when you start to rationalize that, you start to determine that even something as simple as like an intranet strategy could have multiple lenses where we think of the organizational footprint for these HR-like sites for employee onboarding, because that's such a big challenge today, right? Like, what's the pre-boarding experience like? What's the corporate onboarding, departmental onboarding? How do we deal with like the actual onboarding process with Power Platform or whatever you're going to use? Like, there's a lot of different elements to a plan like this, and each of them can use different Microsoft insights, right? So new products that are coming from Microsoft and how they might correlate to those. And of course, if we think of what else is happening in the organization, again, Microsoft should be a lens that we look at our own organizational approach and say, are we optimal right now, right? Are we kind of up to date with what Microsoft's doing? So I'm a huge fan of roadmaps. I know I've talked about them a lot, but I think more organizations need to have them. It doesn't need to be an intranet adjacent roadmap like what I'm showing here. It could be employee experience, digital employee experience. It could be, more broad-based digital workplace. But I definitely think, those roadmaps need to incorporate things like when and how does, the Viva workload of X, fit into our roadmap. And we should have those answers, even if the answers are as simple as, look, it's 6 to 12 months, or it's 12 to 24 months. We know generally when we think that that's going to hit, that's good enough too, right? Even if you don't know how it hits or the sequence. So yeah, that's just my quick commentary on, how we rationalize some of the Microsoft push of new opportunities for us. Cool. All right, and let's move on to the next question. But feel free to chime in if you have any other comments there. So many organizations. Sort of the question in summary here was, what are the things? How do we keep up with Microsoft? And one of the ways we thought about answering this is that organizations need to update their operating model. So I showed an example, and we'll talk more about this. But I showed an example where we have a roadmap. It's proactive, right? Like we're planning ahead, and then based on that proactive design, right, we're now able to plug in where Microsoft innovation fits, instead of reactively responding to Microsoft innovation. And I think that that's generally what I would suggest, and that just changed the way we operate. But did you have more you wanted to share here, Christian?
Yeah, all this makes me think of like my earliest experiences in doing enterprise application deployments. Is that we are so far away, and you can't be still existing within the that old waterfall method. Like, let's get all the requirements in, let's build out per that. You need to constantly be viewing what's coming and the timing of those pieces, and make sure that, because of all the integration pieces, and we'll get to this a little bit later, like the number of tools, the number of SaaS applications that we're leveraging, and like all these other things that are part of modern work now, you have to be looking at how things are changing, how things are evolving. Because as soon as you get locked down and say, well, we're going to add no more, we're going to go build on this for 3-4 months, your employees will move away from that already. Employees need to get their work done. And so they will go and they will leverage the tools and services that are required for that. Whether or not this is the whole shadow IT discussion, whether or not they're authorized for that. And so you need to proactively be out there looking at how is the business changing? How are the tools evolving and changing? What opportunities is this going to bring? And what do we need to be doing today to align us so that we can take advantage of those new features?